Did you get that? Yeah.
All right, welcome to Belling History with the Good Time Girls, a hyper-local podcast about the quirky history of Bellingham, Washington, and the fourth corner of the United States. Even though we like to keep things close to home, these stories are no less entertaining to the masses and those who find themselves unfortunately outside of the PNW. We are your hosts. I'm Colby.
And I'm Ren, and we are co-owners of Belling History Tours, also known as the Good Time Girls. If you want to know more about our tour business, visit our website at bellinghistory.com. Today, we have another re-release episode from our Bad Town series, which was season 2 of the City of Subdued podcast, hosted by Annika Fleming and Dalla Gasparina, and co-hosted by us, as well as our founding mother, Marissa McGrath. We recorded these episodes back in 2020 during the old pandemic, so if you haven't heard them before, as you've heard, feel free to skip them and wait until the spring. We will be back with the daffodils with new and glorious episodes, but otherwise have a little re-listen, and then Colby and I are going to chime in at the end too, so there's a little new info.
Today's episode is called Bad Trial Town. In this episode, we are going into intimate detail on the long trial in which an enraged and abusive husband murders his wife and her lover, who also happens to be his daughter's husband.
Dun, dun, dun.
Spoiler. It's a lot to explain. It gets deep. So, this is a story we got to tell on our limited edition See Home Gore and Lore tours. But as you will see, the story is the long version. Pun intended. So this episode was a great opportunity to tell it more fully.
A little trigger warning. This episode does include talk of domestic violence and should be consumed with care. So there's lots to say, so let's get to it. See you after the episode.
Ding! Ooga, ooga.
I like it.
Hello, it's Maria, and welcome to Bad Town, where we discuss the darkest and baddest parts of Bellingham and Whatcom County history. We are joined today by Colby and Ren from the Good Time Girls. So, what kind of story are you telling me today?
So today we've titled our story For the Love of Moses, Extramarital Murder in New Whatcom. So just a trigger warning for everybody before we get into it. This story does include descriptions of domestic violence. So that said, our story today is about a murder that occurred on Forest Street, which is and right next to where the Majestic Hall is. And this sordid tale sort of involves a whole cast of really messed up folks.
So, before we get rolling with the story, I want you guys to set the mood a little bit and maybe tell me some details about the time and, of course, the place this story is going to be happening in.
Okay, so in 1891, when this story happened, Bad Town, or Bellingham, was actually 2 cities at that time, which was Fairhaven and New Whatcom. You probably recognize Fairhaven as our quaint South Side neighborhood shopping district. It was once its own town, and then the north side of town was New Whatcom at the time. They were each born of smaller cities who united all to become Bellingham proper in late 1903. But in 1890s, let's go back to that, this was the fourth corner of the continental United States, or kind of the last frontier. Our area, we like to say, was colonized by failed 49ers. The Miners, not the football team. But basically in the early 1850s, you had a bunch of guys showing up trying to look for resources to exploit and a way to make a living. And this was a pretty difficult place to get to. And by the 1890s, you finally had some railroads coming in, connections north and south. And most of the towns on the whole coast were all hoping to be a terminus for a railroad, namely J.J. Hill's Great Northern Railroad. which was being built at the time. So there was a lot of booming and activity happening in the 1890s, trying to get excited about railroads and increased access to the area. So the population really exploded from a few hundred people, who accessed the area largely by boat to being able to come on a train. You had a lot more people coming in, population in the thousands. So yeah, there would be an economic collapse in 1893, and the boom would go bust. But at least when our story is set, it was prime boomtown o'clock, 1891. Things were pretty Wild Westy. It was still a very lopsided and masculine single male population. They were the people who showed up first and the women tended to follow. So let's see. The infrastructure of the towns was, because of that, largely financed by sin and gin, as we like to say. Basically, there was a thriving system of brothels and saloons that supplied the city with fees and money to pay for things like planked sidewalks or policemen. So it was an interesting time. And it was an interesting time to be a woman, as if there wasn't an interesting time to be a woman.
Well, I'm sort of tempted to say that I'd love to take a time machine to go back and visit this, but maybe maybe I wouldn't have such a good time being a lady.
Yeah, being a lady wasn't so easy. I mean, I think if you're a woman in this time, the ideal is to get married and make a house for somebody and have babies. That's pretty much all you're really meant to do. Women who were single could have a job and not be looked down upon so much by society. But once you were married, you were in the house. And if you were married and you had a job, it looked bad and it was kind of disgraceful, because that meant that the husband isn't making enough money to take care of you and the children. So this is when most women are at home. Their whole lives are meant to make their husband comfortable. That includes how the woman herself looks and how the house looks and the kids look. And so, yeah, it was very much based around another person, and your desires and wishes and dreams would have been considered selfish at the time. So yeah, a lot of women got married young, as soon as they left their folks' house or were old enough to take care of another house.
I hate the thought of being an old maid. And I know that if I went back in that time machine, probably be past my prime as far as finding a husband goes. Should we, get rolling with a Once Upon a Time?
Yeah, let's do it. So this crime occurred on December 2nd, 1891. I'm going to read a little bit from the Weekly World newspaper of Fairhaven at the time. The headline read, "Murdered Both of Them." At 8 o'clock Wednesday night, the residents in the vicinity of Forest Street in New Whatcom were startled by 5 pistol shots fired in rapid succession. Deputy Sheriff Charlotte and Officer Sevier hastened to 1055 Forest Street, the scene of the shooting, and found that David Long had shot and instantly killed his wife, Susan E. Long, and his son-in-law, Norman Humes, both of whom were found lying in a pool of blood at the back door of the house, out of which the murderer had escaped. Officer Sevier, who was the first to arrive at the scene of the shooting, tried to force open the front door, and finding it securely fastened on the inside, ran around to the rear door and heard the murderer as he beat a hasty retreat through the yard at the rear of the house, but was unable to locate him in the darkness.
Oh.
So yeah, it's an exciting description. And it goes on to describe the scene of the crime as described by witnesses at the scene and investigators. The shooting took place in a small 3-room cottage, while Norman Humes and his wife, whose name was Ida, and her mother, his mother-in-law, Susan, were all seated at the supper table in the kitchen. The house was described as very scantily furnished, the front room containing only a bed, 2 chairs, a trunk, and a sewing machine. Anyway, so while they were all sitting at the table, Long entered the rear door with a revolver in his hand and apparently exclaimed, "I'll settle this," and fired 5 shots in rapid succession, one of which passed through his wife. She was killed instantly. Another struck Humes, his son-in-law, in the top of the head and came out his neck. He was also killed. So Ida, his daughter, the wife of Humes, stepped over the body of her husband and ran out the back door screaming, "You've killed my mother!" And he supposedly said to her, "Don't tell anybody, baby," and disappeared into the darkness. This is what the newspaper reported. So it's
Scandalous.
I know. So he disappears, and for a while it was thought that Long had drowned himself or took his own life. This happened a lot in these domestic violence kind of situations. But really, he had just gone into hiding on Lummi Island. And he came out and gave himself up about a week later after he got hungry. So he was charged with murder in the first degree, and the trial commenced the following March, and it was huge news at the time.
So this seems way too weird to be like the beginning or the end of this story. Are there more details?
Yeah,
it gets deep. So we got to start with like who everybody is, where they're from. David is born in 1850 in Illinois. He's 5'6", he's thick-set, he has blue eyes, a mustache, of course, because everybody did. And then he was known for carrying a holstered Colt 45. And then the wife, Susan Russell Long, who was murdered, and she is born in 1858 in Illinois, making her age 16 when she married David Long in 1874. She was a comely woman who possessed an ugly disposition.
Oh,
isn't that
that's
mean?
mean.
So she was pretty, but she's kind of a B word. And then the daughter, Ida, who was born in Missouri in 1876, she was described as a child of little intellect or feeble-minded. And they said she looked about 13, even though she was 16 years old. So she was really small. She had a dark olive complexion. And the Fairhaven Herald said that she had, quote, squirrel teeth that were always exposed. And this is the daughter of David Long and the wife of Norman Humes. Her mom was sleeping with her husband. Okay, so then there's Norman Humes, who is the lover and the husband. So Norman Hughes is the wife's lover and the feeble-minded daughter's husband. So and he's born in 1870 in Nova Scotia. He's 21 when this happens. He has red hair. And he's working at Cornwall Mill. So some accounts say he was sober and industrious young man, and some accounts say that he would frequent saloons and gambling dens. So I'm assuming that probably depended upon your fear of David Long and his Colt 45 at the time of the trial. But at any rate, the Long family arrived here in Bellingham Bay around 1887 from Texas. And David Long has been working there as a cowboy. They came here and bought a piece of property in the Columbia Eldridge neighborhood, which was known at the time as Kieslingville, if you're familiar with Kiesling Street in this neighborhood. And so the story goes that the Longs went to a Salvation Army meeting in January of 1891, where the handsome, red-headed Norman Hughes was seated behind them. And Humes befriended the family and began courting the daughter, Ida. But most people guessed he was really into the mother, Susan, and obviously she to him. So Susan and Norman essentially used this courtship of Ida as a cover for their love affair.
Right. And like we said, pretty much everyone involved in this case was a mess. So there's not really any like shining examples of humanity here, but it was a sensational story, and Ida's testimony during the trial definitely made everyone look bad. Ida was quoted as saying, "I thought he came to see me, but found it was Mother. Mama would put a white rag out the window when Papa was away." So it was pretty clear from the trial that, yeah, her mom was having an affair with this guy, Norman, who she was married to. She also testified to seeing them with their arms around each other and going into rooms and locking the doors. All kinds of incriminating evidence that there was definitely an affair going on there. Susan also apparently attempted to poison her husband, David Long, at some point in that year. His coffee and bread he felt was bitter, and he became violently ill. And he actually took the bread to have it analyzed and all this. And actually, after the murders happened, a bottle of strychnine was found in one of her cloaks. So it does seem like she tried to poison her husband. But after this poisoning attempt, David Long was taken aside by someone who worked with Norman Hughes, and he was like, "Hey, dude, I saw a man and a young woman in a compromising position near the Columbia School, and the woman had a red petticoat on." And Long was like, "Oh, that's my daughter, Ida. she has a red petticoat. So it's not really clear whether it was Ida or Susan, but it seems like right after this, Susan's like, I think Ida's pregnant. I'm taking her to the doctor, and I really think Humes needs to marry her. So it seems like Susan and Norman Humes came up with this scheme in which he would knock up Ida, the daughter, and thus have to marry her so they could continue their affair. Except Ida wasn't pregnant, but Susan still tried to convince him that this marriage needed to happen. David was like, nah, she's too young. I'm not into this. But her wishes prevailed, and they were married on October 15th of 1891. And they moved into the house all together there in Kieslingville. Super awkward. So there was an incident that happened shortly after. I think David Long is kind of, a lot of people thought he was naive, and a lot of people saw this happening and thought he was not, really paying close enough attention to the whole situation. But he was starting to pick up on, okay, this is some shenanigans are going on. So at one point he locks his wife out of the house. He suspects she's with Norman Humes. And Humes actually reported to the newspaper that his father-in-law met him on the train tracks near Squalicum with 2 shotgun tunnels staring him in the face, asking him where Susan was. But she wasn't with him, at least not at that moment. So Long was really trying to find evidence of this affair, and he actually cut a trapdoor in the floor of the closet and hid in it, but he was making too much noise and his wife caught him. So, yeah, right? So there's like all this struggles and trauma going on in the house and arguing. So Norman Humes and Ida, the daughter, who are now married, move out to the house on Forest Street in Seaholme between Maple and Laurel Streets. But not long after, Susan's like, okay, bye, I'm leaving you, and left David and goes and moves in with them, conveniently. Long apparently came regularly and, begged her to come home, but she refused. So he starts spying on them from underneath the Forest Street house. And at one point, he was under there and apparently heard them discussing all going to bed together as a threesome.
Oh, no. That's the worst thing I've heard so far.
Right? So scandalous. So Ida, the daughter, refused, and he heard Susan threatening to whip her. And that is when he was enraged and burst out and went in and shot everyone but Ida. And afterwards, he reportedly said, Ida, for God's sake, do not tell what I have done. And he took off.
Yeah.
I feel bad for Ida. Poor girl. Not too pretty, not too smart,
Just a pawn. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so according to the reports, Ida really didn't appear affected much by the whole tragedy. She was just sort of blank.
I've been wondering if she was like maybe a little autistic or something.
It sounds like that.
Oh, that makes it so much worse.
And so, yeah, like, what Colby was saying, that whole thing about the threesome and all of that he heard from under the porch was all his testimony because everyone else was dead. And Ida is clearly not, within her means to kind of tell really what happened. As far as I've seen, she doesn't speak of that. So, but she does say, they say she told the story of the shooting with an entire lack of emotion and went away with the officer without a sign of regret at parting with her dead mother and husband. So Ida's testimony during the trial really, like Colby said, painted everybody in a bad light. And she says that they were in all kinds of compromising situations. But she says, Father was good to Mama. I knew all the time she was doing things she ought not to do. But then she also says, one day, Father told me he had a notion to kill all 3 of us, but he had made such threats many times before. And since I was a little girl, I have learned to take them as a matter of course. So repeated, obviously emotional abuse happening since she was a little kid. And then she also says Mother left him before. He often abused Mother, and she would show me marks of his cruelty. He accused her of being intimate with my Uncle Charlie Long and with 2 or 3 others here in town. He accused her of being intimate with a man in Texas where we lived before coming here. He has drawn his revolver several times before, but I did not think he would shoot. So then a lot of witnesses had also testified to seeing black marks on Susan where David Long had struck her. And many testified that Long had often threatened to do bodily harm to both his wife and his son-in-law. The day before the murder, he reportedly went to the Hume's house and begged his wife to return and live with him, threatening in case of her continued refusal to shoot them all. So no thought was entertained at the time that he would carry his desperate threat into execution, as in anger he had often made similar threats, which he had afterward forgotten. So this is pretty common, and there's a lot of witnesses that say, yeah, I talked to him. He was definitely saying he was going to kill them. Yeah, he was sort of a violent fellow. Obviously, he's known for carrying this Colt 45 on his hip. Long himself was emotional, though, on the stand when they went to interrogate him, and he said breaking down and he was crying, and he claimed it was accidental. And when they asked how that could be, he replied, well, God only knows, but that is the way of it. And then he says, now, just think of a mother treating her only child in that way was awful. To think of her committing adultery with her son-in-law and made her only child marry the man to hide her own guilt.
They're certainly all unsavory. I definitely have to agree with you there.
Yeah, this is like a classic tabloid fodder kind of a trial.
Imagine being the neighbors.
Yeah, it was in every newspaper all over the region and beyond at the time. So this was a big, juicy, salacious story. I just want to talk a little bit about the dream team of lawyers. So David Long hires local lawyer Thomas G. Newman, who is super hot, I gotta say, from looking at his photos. He was very handsome. So anyway, he hires T.G. Newman, who is this hotshot, handsome, wealthy local lawyer. He has this gorgeous house on Knox Avenue. Newman recruits for the lawyer team this guy from Seattle who's known as Colonel James Hamilton Lewis, sometimes referred to as J-Ham or Ham Lewis, also Dude Lewis or Habeas Corpus Lewis. He had a lot of nicknames.
All these cool, like, lawyer aliases.
I'm just going to call him J-Ham. I love it. So J-Ham is like a phenomenon of his time. He's described as being really comical in appearance. He had this trademark, like, bushy beard that were like Van Dyke style, big whiskers that were not in style at the time. It was considered kind of odd that he had this crazy style. And he also wore a wavy pink toupee.
No, this is the guy?
Lawyer J-Ham. So he made no effort to hide that it was a toupee. He also dyed his whiskers a pinkish color, apparently. He was just sort of this flamboyant dandy. He was known as a clothes horse who wore spats, even though those were out of fashion. Also, bright green tie, matching socks, silk handkerchief, that whole bit. And one time he was actually cautioned to tone down his dress to go to this meeting of like laborers, but instead he came in full tails and top hat because that's what he does. So he was from the South. He was actually born in Virginia and raised in Georgia. And after he went through all law school, he came to Washington in 1885. And he really had a pretty amazing career as a criminal lawyer. He defended 32 murderers and only lost one verdict while he was here. So he was a good lawyer to have. Ren, do you want to talk a little bit about what he said during the trial, some of his fancy talk?
Yeah, so J-Ham, in his concluding remarks, I mean, and just to give you guys kind of an idea of his oratories, they said that his graceful, flowing rhetoric, dramatic delivery, and wealth of historical and literary allusion kind of helped him to win this trial. And so Lewis talks for hours and hours, and he puts on this huge show. But he describes Long's meeting of Hume's, the son-in-law, like this. He says, a young man of serpent-like eyes, reddish hair, and a daredevil demeanor sat behind them. It was Norman Hume's, and he became intimate with the family and seduced the weak-minded daughter. Long came to distrust him and learned that his wife had become infatuated with him. They carried on for months a criminal intrigue. They had a code of signals by which the guilty woman would summon her paramour to her house when her husband went out to earn her bread. So in closing, he extends one arm above his head for dramatic flair, and he bellows, "This is the law. If a man be found lying with a woman married to a husband, then they shall both of them die, both the man that lay with the woman and the woman herself. So shalt thou put away evil from Israel."
Wow. So, I mean, I wish I could have been there to see this, because this seems like it was really providing a lot of entertainment for the whole town. What with this, like, clown J. Ham, somehow a genius lawyer and, like, Liberace at the same time. Did J. Ham end up winning the trial for long? What was the outcome?
Yes, he did. His passionate speech and his arguments resulted in David Long's acquittal by a jury of his peers. The headlines read, "David Long, not guilty. The jury returns a verdict in accordance with the law," in parentheses then, "of Moses. A warning to unfaithful wives and adulterous men." I'm not a Bible expert, but I was like, what is this law of Moses? I had to look all this up because I was raised a heathen. So from what I understand, the law of Moses, or Mosaic law, is like old school Bible stuff. First 5 books of the Hebrew Bible were traditionally believed to have been written by Moses, although, probably not. Lots of people probably wrote it. This was like the law of God, like above civil law. So the 10 Commandments are part of this. It's essentially, there's 3 books of the Bible, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And then the law is kind of reiterated and added to in Deuteronomy. That's right, Deuteronomy. So this is what's invoked in the trial specifically, is Deuteronomy 22:22. If a man is found lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die, the man who lay with the woman and the woman. So you shall purge the evil from Israel. Yeah. So Deuteronomy is actually, the etymology, it means second law. I think of it in my brain as Dude-eronomy, because basically this whole chapter is a bunch of laws that are mostly beneficial for dudes. And specifically the 22nd chapter, what we're talking about, and within that chapter, sections 13 to 30 deal with laws around family and sex, specifically like dishonesty and violence and sexual relations. So this is like, I don't know, to me, the so problematic stuff here. And it made me start thinking about the separation of church and state, and that I was raised to believe that we have here in America. But really, despite the First Amendment, our country was founded, largely by Christians, and so much of the criminal justice system has been shaped and just full of Christian views and attitudes and things. If you think about when you're in the court, you swear on a Bible to tell the truth. In fact, it was only pretty recently that they created an alternative to that, because they're like, well, I guess if you don't believe in God, why would you care about swearing on the Bible to tell the truth? So they created this affirmation thing where you affirm your testimony is the truth, and under the pains and penalties of perjury. But let's get back to the trial. And Ren, do you want to talk about how the verdict went over?
Yeah. So, it's really depressing to think that this verdict went over, or that it happened like it did, and that Long was just off, because he had fully admitted to what he did. He killed 2 people and he ran away.
Yeah, lots of evidence of that.
And he admitted to that. He never, so for them to not penalize him whatsoever and to use this biblical kind of law or, tact that the pink-haired man used was pretty outrageous. And I think, obviously there were people who maybe agreed with that, but there were a lot of people, thankfully, even in 1891, who did not agree with that. And there was, obviously, as Colby said, this was, national news. And there were a lot of people who kind of expressed their outrage that this was part of the law and that he had gotten off.
I just think it's really interesting. The Seattle Daily Intelligencer had actually called it like right after the murder in December, before the trial even began. Do you want to read that quote?
Yeah. So like Colby was saying, they predicted what was going to happen, and they said the frightful murder of his wife and son-in-law is a case of private vengeance. Meaning, this guy, we believe he was wronged, so he's totally, fully, valid in what he did. So there was a lot of like public, like, yeah, we totally get it. That's just what we do here in America. And then there was also a lot of people that were like, wait a minute, the law says if you kill somebody, you should be penalized. So yeah, there's a couple really interesting quotes. I love this one that, quote, men who did not hesitate to inflict domestic wrong were the first to revenge it by murder. Which is pretty intense.
Yeah, I love this quote. Can I just say this one? It is the absurd habit of our American people to be very lenient with ugly fellows who do murder the moment they think they do well to be angry. So there was a lot of criticism of it as being sort of an American phenomenon to run around with guns and solve all our problems by killing each other. And then our justice system is just meh.
I'll just read one more and then we will talk a little bit about after. They say, the Englishman, rather than go to the scaffold, elects to be content with divorce and civil damages. But in America, we make a bloody burlesque of justice by saying that any man may safely slay his fellow if he can make a jury believe that he believed his victim was criminally intimate. So basically, I make you believe that it's cool and that he deserved it, like we just said, and or
it's your character, you're an adulterer, you're a drug addict, you're this, so you deserve whatever happened to you.
So what happened to David Long after he was acquitted of this murder, this series of murders?
Oh, well, he moved to Arizona where he married a Mexican-American and had a big family, lots of kids. He lived to old age. One of his daughters lived to be 96. She just died in 2000. The feeble-minded daughter, Ida, I hate saying that, but it's what they always called her. Ida Long disappeared from the records, cannot find a trace of her. And Susan Long is buried in an unmarked grave in Bayview Cemetery, and Norman Hume's body was sent to his family in Canada for burial. I actually had a bunch of contact with some ancestors from Susan Long's family, shirt tail relatives who were doing genealogy, and they also tried to find what happened to Ida. And none of us could find out what happened to her, which is really sad and unsatisfying. But I kind of imagine that Long probably had her institutionalized, and that's where she disappears from the records.
Poor Ida.
Yeah. Ren, do you want to talk a little bit about, let's get into some modern parallels and things with this?
So then I kind of just wanted to touch on, too, the Violence Against Women Act that happened in 1994. So again, a full 100 years later before we have federal protection for women being abused. And the act was actually sponsored primarily by Joe Biden in 1994. And it was a huge deal. There was a significant legislation to address domestic and sexual violence. And one of the greatest successes was that it put an emphasis on this coordinated community response. So it kind of made everything cohesive within states and cities in order to respond to domestic violence and sex and dating violence and sexual assault, stalking, and law enforcement, prosecutors, all of these people kind of working together to become this kind of there's a cohesive law between states and the federal government. And it was a huge deal. And to think that that's 100 years later, and we're talking here about Susan, being domestically abused. We've got hundreds of years of people not being protected, of there not being actual, enforceable, solid, across the board laws is just mind-blowing to begin with.
Cue Johnny Cash, Delia's gone.
I know, can we put that in? Just 20 seconds of that. So, but I mean, it gets even wilder because that's really cool. Yeah, 1994, we finally get it in. Hooray, victory. And then for the next, couple decades, it has to be reauthorized and refunded, right? And so it gets refunded for the next couple of decades. But then we get to 2018, 2019, when the government shutdown happens under old Trumpy and the act is allowed to expire. So now it's no longer there. It's no longer being funded, which, by the way, a lot of these programs are being funded under this act. And then when a new bill is introduced, it is killed by the Republican Senate because the new bill includes a boyfriend loophole. And that boyfriend loophole is seeking to prevent abusive partners from acquiring guns. So if you have a record of domestic abuse, you cannot get a gun anymore. And we all know that the Republicans are in the pocket of the NRA, who doesn't care who has access to guns, be it abusive partners or teenagers or in schools. So they vote it down. And now we are here without an act, a Violence Against Women Act. It's not been refunded under Trump. So hooray for that.
That's scary and sad.
It's terribly scary and sad. And I think, I guess in what we're having a conversation about history, but, history is not linear. You don't just get to learn the lesson and go up. You have to learn it over and over again.
Yeah. I just, this just brought up so much for me with our criminal justice system. I mean, right now we're seeing, it has a lot of flaws and faults that are so systemic and just built in. And I feel like this is right there with it. And that domestic violence, really correlates with poverty, and for both men and women. And just the way it's dealt with is so problematic. And in fact, encouraging a larger role for law enforcement, interestingly, has had an unintended consequences of more women being arrested instead of men, which is kind of weird. And just putting victims in these weird positions of having to testify or go to jail. Just, I don't know. There's so many problems around it. I don't know where to begin.
So it's such a large topic, but for now, do we want to wrap up, sum up, have final thoughts about the long trial?
I mean, I think, the takeaway that kind of I get from the trial is that this was really a wild and woolly place to live. And people romanticize a lot of this period of history and the Wild West, but people were really on their own, and especially women out here in 1891. You think as the Good Time Girls, we put on cute little corsets and we have fun with these ideas. But when it comes down to it, you were one woman amongst many, many wild men. And you were really in a lot of danger just all the time. And that to me is kind of the most that I take away from this, is just how vulnerable not only was Susan, but also Ida.
Yeah, I don't know. My big thing with this was just how intertwined, the Christianity thing was with justice and that sort of like fundamentalism and believing that there's some laws of God that are, above any laws that men make. And that to me is really heavy and problematic.
Yeah. Well, and it made women even more vulnerable, right? Not only are you vulnerable because you're just around a bunch of crazy miners and loggers, you're vulnerable because the courts are just, they're adhering to these chaotic patriarch kind of things.
Right.
I guess my thought, I don't know if it's like the most important, but it's the one I'm thinking of right now, is how many people apparently heard all of these threats before all this happened and couldn't be bothered to do anything about it.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate. You think that someone would have been a friend. Someone would have helped out Ida. Someone would have let Susan and her icky boyfriend know that it was time to make a run for it.
Right. Or why couldn't Susan just divorce her husband and go off with this lover?
Seems like everyone would have been happier that way.
Yeah, if they could have just divorced, gone their separate ways. Why did she have to resort to trying to poison her husband? And then
that should tell you a lot about how hard it was to divorce and what she was, expecting to get.
I hope none of you listeners out there have to resort to poisoning anyone to get what you want. So the 24-hour DVSAS hotline is 1-877-715-1563. Don't be a Susan. I mean, if you could help it, run away with your lover and never look back. I don't know if that's the right take.
Right. There's no right take to this story, I don't think. There's no way to wrap it up with a nice bow and be like, wouldn't it be great if only this? It's just too problematic.
But it's certainly Bad Town. It's got those vibes. It's like old-timey reality TV, true crime. We hope you enjoyed this story. There's going to be many more interesting, scandalous, salacious stories on the way. So with that, I'm going to say good night, and I love you, listeners. Thank you so much, Good Time Girls, for joining me on this episode.
You're welcome.
Yeah,
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Okay, stick in some bonus questions here from the final bonus episode where we answered listener questions. Also, if you have questions that we don't answer,
Yes,
send them on to us.
we'd love that.
All right, here they are.
We have a few questions from episode 5, Bad Trial Town, aka For the Love of Moses, about the crazy love triangle murder trial and acquittal of Mr. Long. So our first question about this episode comes from Izzy, and she asks, what are the pros and cons about being an old maid in the late 1800s?
I love this. So it's complicated. It was a complicated time to be a woman. And also, like, old maid is kind of an old term. Like, we're talking about a person, like a confirmed bachelorette, a person who's chosen not to be married. She's not necessarily not been chosen. Maybe she's made a choice out of agency to not be married. One of the things is, like, women have for centuries been treated more like property once they become married. And if you wanted to have a semblance of control, these are choices that people are still making about whether or not to be partnered or to get married. You want to have a semblance of control over your finances, your day-to-day decisions, where you're going to live. There were a lot of rules about, up until in my mother's lifetime, in many states, it wasn't illegal to rape a woman that you were married to or beat a woman that you were married to in many states. And so, your ability to have the say over whether or not you were going to stay in an abusive situation was very limited. Obviously, some of the cons are that women then as now made a lot less money than men. And that while you might have had more choice, there was a lot of limitations about whether you could own property or have credit in your name. If you needed someone to co-sign on a man to co-sign on purchasing a house. The thing that a lot of people didn't realize until Ruth Bader Ginsburg died is that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was really brought before the Supreme Court a case to make it possible for women to be able to have credit or purchase a home without getting a man's co-sign on it. And so this is the type of thing that this is a huge unpacking that would need to happen. It's a long list. There were lots of
I feel like I just want to jump in and say that historically, especially, it was definitely easier for women of means who had some kind of, say, inheritance or wealthy family and or education, which often went hand in hand, to live without marrying for their entire lives and live a decent life. But if you were working class and uneducated and didn't have those things to fall back on, you had a lot less choices. Let's just put it that way. I just want to give a shout out, though, to the spinsters out there in the history of the world, because, moneyed and educated in particular, they had that privilege, but those ladies got a lot of stuff done because of that privilege and that money and that education that they received, and not having children and a husband. They got a lot of shit done historically. Right. So
yeah, absolutely. And I would say that's probably true in communities even when there isn't a lot of money, right? So like the women who are volunteering at the church and getting things done in a small community often are the women who are unburdened by children and husbands to take care of.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Shout out to the single ladies.
All the single ladies.
Okay, so this is another question from an anonymous asker. They want to know if there were any more fun Bellingham trials that were a media circus.
Okay, where do you even start? Yeah, people were bored. There was not radio even in those early days. Really, the only publications most people ever saw were in local newspapers. So that was like the exciting things to read about, stories about trials. If you could attend a trial, heck yeah, why not? Go and watch that stuff go down. So a lot of them, I'm sure, were total media circus. And, just the one that always pops into my mind is the prelay bootlegging case that we talk about in, I forget what episode number that is. That was my great grandpa. And, they talked about how, the courtroom was like standing room only, people in the hallways. That was just a bootlegging case. So they were all a circus.
So it's been a little while since we've heard that story, although we've been telling a condensed version on those tours last year. And it's kind of fun because we were taking people down the alley, which is between Maple and Laurel Streets. Above State Street.
Right.
So the Majestic Hall, which faces Forest Street, is on the lot right next door where this house would have stood that the murder happened in. And we would go up the alley behind the gas station or the auto repair place there.
Yep.
And behind Northwest Youth Services and kind of creep down that alley, which is really cool because there's a lot of little buildings left in those alleys from the old
From that era.
town of Seahome.
Yeah.
When that was the main drag of the town, State Street / Elk Street. And it was sort of facing the bay there, and they just would build these little tiny houses all facing the waterfront.
Out to the bay, yeah.
And some of them remain in those alleys, so...
Yeah, and their front doors actually face into the alleys.
Yeah,
It's pretty
and they're
cool.
like a little ADU nowadays.
Just a little carriage
Little
house
college
almost
living,
looking.
but yeah. It was cool to get to go stand on the spot.
Really cool. I think that's one of my favorite, physical locations that we brought people to. It just evokes that time and place, and it was really spooky. Also, especially at night in October.
Yes, so you can go check it out. What do you think, Ren? Do you have any follow-up thoughts on this?
I do have follow-up thoughts. This one's a deep one. Thankfully, I do have a little update now that we've moved beyond Trump era, where the Violence Against Women Act was reinstated, thank God, by the Biden administration in 2022. Yay! This time, it has the highest funding in its history. And among many things, it is doing more to work to narrow that boyfriend loophole that we talked about in the episode. So to read more about that, visit whitehouse.gov. Obviously, there's no great way to wrap this up or tie a bow around it. But I did just want to say our deepest respect and condolences to the women throughout history whose lives ended too soon and whose value was tragically dismissed as the property of men. We see you and we love you. And if you or someone you love is experiencing domestic violence, you can find help and resources at dvsas.org. What about you, Colby?
Indeed. This one is just a hard story to tell.
It is.
Because nobody really comes across as Ida. Poor Ida. I just think about Ida.
The hardest.
She's the loser here, clearly. I know I don't have any follow-up details. Still don't know what happened to her.
Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah. That's sad.
Okay, insert record scratch here. So that wraps up the episode. Before we go, a reminder that we will be hosting a holiday party at the Hotel Leo's Crystal Ballroom on Friday, December 22nd. So if you're around Bellingham, check it out and see our website for more details.
Well, hey there, mama, where'd you go? You gotta reap just what you sow. That's too bad, too bad. To that old time, the old man hicks without bad weather. Put on the side, they were sold together. That's too bad, to listen to that old time music.
We'd like to thank you all for listening to Belling History with the Good Time Girls. Do subscribe and review our podcast on your favorite podcast platforms. Like us on all the social medias. Check out our tours and events. Read our show notes and blog. All of that at bellinghistory.com.
Oh, Lou loves you, land, Lou loves you blue. Most of the time, Lou just loves you blue. That's too bad. To listen to that old time music. I lost my hat, I lost my brim. I look like crows just swinging on a limb. That's too bad. To listen to that old time music.
And as always, we'd like to thank Devin Champlin and the late great Lucas Hicks for the use of the Gallus Brothers song, Too Bad West Coast Blues. You can find the Gallus Brothers and Devin Champlin tunes on Bandcamp, and you can find Devin Champlin at his cute little shop, Champlin Guitars, down here in Bellingham.
Lost my hat, lost my brim. Looking like a crow's nest swinging from a limb. That's too bad, too bad. Well, I got no bugging, I got no smokes. I look like Grandpap and all of his folks. That's too bad. To listen to that old time music.
Tune in next time for a little more Bad Town and Belling history.
Thank you. Thanks.